Okay, great. Let's get started. So, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this Royal Society of Chemistry webinar. What does trustworthy peer review look like? I'm delighted to have so many of you register and join the webinar, so welcome to everyone who's joining us from around the world. We have participants from India, United States, United Kingdom, Brazil, Mexico, China, Germany, Spain. The list goes on. In fact, we had people from over 60 countries register for our event, which is absolutely wonderful to see. And we also have a wide range of career stages represented in our audience today. So we had students, postgrads, postdocs, through to professors and industry professionals as well. And when you registered, we asked you about your experiences in peer review, and many of you told us you've been an author or a co-author on a paper. A good proportion of you told us you've been reviewers, and some of you have served as editors. We welcome all of you, whether you're joining us live or listening to the recording, and we hope you find the discussion both interesting and informative. So my name is Nicola Nugent, and I'm Publishing Manager Quality and Ethics at the Royal Society of Chemistry. I have responsibility for making sure that the peer review across our journals is high quality and rigorous, as well as fair and inclusive. And I've convened this panel today to hear from those involved in peer review across our journals about how we can cultivate and contribute to a trustworthy peer review process. And I'll also be asking our panelists their views on different peer review models and how we can improve peer review in future. Many of you submitted questions for the panel during the registration process, and I hope you'll find that throughout our discussion we cover topics that you're interested in. We'll also be taking questions directly from the audience, so if you do have an unanswered question, please do type your question into the chat box. My colleagues behind the scenes will be monitoring the chat, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. Finally, just to say, this event is part of our Peer Review Week activities. Peer Review Week is an annual global event celebrating the essential role that peer review plays in maintaining scientific quality, and the theme this year is Trust in Peer Review. Please do tweet us at RoySocChem using hashtag #TrustInPeerReview to share your experiences, and you can also follow hashtag PeerRevWeek20 for more on Peer Review Week. So with that, I'll ask for the screen share to end, and I'm going to ask our panelists to very briefly introduce themselves, and I'll start with you, Rich, if that's okay.
Thank you, Nicola. So I'm Richard Kelly. I'm Executive Editor for 2 of the General Chemistry journals here at the Royal Society of Chemistry, Chemical Communications and Chemical Society Reviews. I have a chemistry background, but I'm now a full-time editor. I've been at the RSC in publishing for 16 years, and initially I was handling papers as a publishing editor, but for the last 10 years I've been an executive editor, so that role involves working with our editorial board to set and implement strategy and standards for our journals, and that includes overseeing standards and procedures for peer review to make sure that they're fair, rigorous and inclusive.
Great, thank you, Rich. And Professor Sandeep Verma.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm very happy to be here. I am an associate editor of Chemical Communications. It's a journal published by the Royal Society of Chemistry. Presently, I am a professor in the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur in India, and my areas relate to new drug development, chemical biology, and bio-inspired materials. It's a real privilege to be here and a pleasure because I published my first paper as an independent investigator in Royal Society of Chemistry journal, which is Chemical Communication. So it's a real pleasure to be associated with Royal Society of Chemistry and also to be a part of Peer Review Week. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Natalie. Just one sec, Natalie, I think you're muted.
Yes, I have to unmute myself. I'm Natalie Stingerling. I'm a professor, full professor at Georgia Institute of Technology. I started at RSC as associate professor about 10 years ago. At that time, I was at Imperial College London. And since now, like last year, sort of this year, I became the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Materials Chemistry C. as well as materials advances. So I went from associate editor, I've seen how to handle papers, peer reviews, and now I deal also with other things regarding the publishing, PR of the journal. So I'm really happy to be here because I think there's a lot to discuss about the peer review. So thanks everybody for joining.
Great, thank you. And Beatrice.
Hello. Thank you, Nicola. First of all, I would like to say thank you to you for RSC for inviting me. So I'm Beatrice Jurado. I teach analytical chemistry at University of Alcalá. I'm here because I was recognized outstanding review in RSC Advanced. It's a great honor to me. So apart from review paper, I also author paper. My main research line is the development of micromotors, tubular and Janus micromotor, which are tiny nanoparticles that move in solution for biosensing and environmental degradation application. And thank you so much again for inviting me. If I can give something to peer review or help you with something, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to our esteemed panel for giving their time to join us today. So let's dive straight in with our discussion. And my first question is for both Sandeep and Natalie, who've served as associate editors. So in serving as an associate editor, how do you ensure fairness and rigor in peer review? And perhaps I could direct that to Sandeep first.
Thank you, Nicola. When you look at the peer review process, I consider it as a real important instrument in having the critical appraisal of a research paper or of a science that is about to go out in the open domain. So when you're looking at a peer review process, when you're trying to ensure that there is a process that is just, honest, and transparent, it is extremely critical, and it is a responsibility on associate editors to ensure when you look at a paper, how you handle it, how you assign the right reviewers, and once you get the reviewers review comments back, how you process them and how you communicate it to the authors. Because at the end of the day, authors are looking forward to expert advice, constructive comments, and not really as a criticism per se, but constructive comments which can eventually make their paper better, which can bring the scientific content to can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you, Sandeep. You've frozen just for a moment, unfortunately. While we try and help Sandeep recover, perhaps Natalie, you could take over there. So we're talking about trying to ensure fairness and rigor in peer review as an associate editor.
As mentioned, I have been now associate editor and now editor-in-chief of JMCC and materials advances for about 10 years. What I always try to do is really get a very diverse set of referees. So we are recommended to go for 2 referees. I rather often go to 3 and 4, simply knowing the field, and really ensure that I have referees from various countries and various continents, actually, simply because to avoid maybe some unconscious bias because of competition, or you're in the same field, the same country, etc. So I really try to get different opinions from different areas. In addition, as mentioned, I rather go for 3 and 4 referees. Everybody's also busy. You never know if you actually get the referee report back. But I also usually try to at least have 1 referee report from people I personally know, so I can gauge a bit where it stands, because I believe they will really take care when they respond to me. And of course, we have a system, and therefore also Beatrice is here. We have a rating system of our referees in Scholar One that we can use. So we actually rate the referees, and that helps also a lot. I mean, in the sense of, in case a referee simply says this paper is not novel, I would give that referee a low rating, and that will help other editors. So it's not that we just then use this referee. In case I still get a referee report like that, I still would actually send it out then to another referee. That will prolong the whole referee process a bit, but I rather have then a third or a fourth opinion to make my decision. So therefore, it slows it down a bit, but it helps. And I report back, as I mentioned, that you will rate that specific referee who was actually not helpful, so that other editors are warned about this referee.
That's great, thank you. And that's a really important point to mention. I know that came up through some of the questions we had from our audience when they were registering. So it's important to note that we do take note of the quality of the reviewers' comments, and if reviewers are persistently providing reports that are not helpful for authors, then we should try to avoid using them, of course, as editors. So thanks, that's a really important point, Natalie. I'm hoping Sandeep will be able to join us again, but while he's trying to rejoin, I'll just move on to Beatrice. Please, if you could, you mentioned at the beginning that you've been recognised as an outstanding reviewer on RSC Advances, so congratulations on that. And we've heard from Natalie from the editor's sort of perspective. How do you think reviewers contribute to a trustworthy peer review process?
I think reviewers are a very important part of the peer review process. First of all, you need, as Natalie said and all editors said, you need to avoid bias. This is not professional. You shouldn't consider if the author are male, female, the country. They are professional, they are scientists, and you should consider them as that. Also, another thing I think you need to consider to do a good peer review and trustworthy peer review process, the expertise you have in that field and the time you have at that moment. So first of all, the expertise. If you are not an expert on that field, just decline the offer, because you are not going to be able to do a fair peer review. Another question is the time you have. If you are preparing a grant, you are very busy doing many things, you should decline the review, because the editor give you, every journal give you a time. Some journal give you 2-3 weeks, and some journal give you 3 months. So you should put yourself also in the position of the authors, because they spend time, money, maybe that publication, a grant or a promotion for a professor, for a postdoc, depend on that publication. So don't wait until the very last day of the review and say, okay, I want to reject the paper, because you make them lose their time and the effort. Just with a quick reading of the abstract and of the article, you know if you are going to reject or you are going to accept of anything. Another important thing, as Natalie said, is every comment you give to the paper, if you ask to do a new experiment, if you ask to add a new reference, anything you ask for, you need to do good arguments. Don't say just, you need to do this experiment. You must explain why and what do you feel, what is failing there. Also, for me, is even more important, if you reject an article, if you recommend rejection, just don't say reject or this paper should be rejected. You should give very good reason for this rejection and good recommendations, so they improve the quality of that paper, so it has more chance to get published in the future. Or maybe if you feel that it's not adequate for the journal, just suggest it. Also, I would like to speak about conflict of interest. If you feel you have a conflict of interest, just comment with the editor. That never happened to me before, but just comment with the editor or just decline to do it. But the editor made, from my experience, I think the editors made a very good job with this. So I don't have problem with that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Natalie. You've given some really good tips there, especially an important point about declining if you really can't realistically complete the review on time, or if it's outside your area of expertise. And of course, echoing what Natalie said there about being able to provide constructive comments and detailed justification, I suppose, for the recommendation you're making, so that the editors, so that the author can understand the reviewer's point of view. And I'm delighted to see Sandeep has come back to join us. Sandeep, you were mid-flow telling us about ensuring fairness and rigor in peer review as an associate editor. Could I ask you to carry on where you left off?
I'm sorry about that
No
little
problem.
hiccup. So what I was trying to hint at is that when we are looking at the review process, we are actually trying to judge creativity of an individual and a set of researchers who have put quite a bit of time in constructing a problem, doing experiments, writing a manuscript, and submitting to a journal for critical review. So when we, as associate editor or reviewers, are looking at a manuscript, we are actually trying to critically evaluate it, not only from the standpoint of scientific scrutiny, but we should also remember that the authors or the people who have done the science, they are also looking at constructive criticism so that they can at times make the manuscript better before it is served out in the open through the platform which is offered by journals, which is offered by publishing society. So editors are basically interlocutors, if you will, who have to act without any predilection. So you have to worry about, without any bias, look at the journal, look at the manuscript, assign reviewers, and make sure when you get the reviews back, you have to constructively address and make sure that the authors understand a particular decision. Back to you.
Yes, that's great. Thank you, Sandeep, and an important reminder there of one of the sort of key fundamental points of peer review, of course, is to help authors improve their manuscript. So thank you for those answers. A question now for Richard Kelly. One thing that's often said is that increasing transparency is really important for ensuring trust in peer review. Could you take a moment to tell us about some of the actions that Royal Society of Chemistry journals take to increase transparency?
Yeah, I think what's really important to say is that when, as a journal, we're deciding what the criteria are for whether an article is accepted, often that's around things like whether it's within scope, whether it's scientifically sound, if it's been ethically carried out, but also whether it's of interest to our readers. One of the things that we want to do as a journal is try and filter out some of the most important and significant work, because we know researchers have far too many papers to read in their field. They need to be able to select the most interesting. But because trying to decide whether something is the level of significance is something that's going to be subjective, and that's often why some of the disagreements come up between authors and editors and reviewers. And so as editors, we need to not only have the evidence to make a clear decision on the manuscript, we also need to communicate that really clearly, as Sandeep and Natalie have said. Fundamental to ensuring that people feel the process is fair, they have trust in the system, is that they understand why a decision has been made. And that's often one of the concerns that authors have. It's not that the decision is incorrect, it's just that it hasn't been communicated to them in a way that you understand most. So I think from a transparency point of view, a journal having really clear guidelines is extremely important, so that it's clear both to authors what the guidelines are when they see when their manuscript has been accepted or rejected, also so that editors and referees can calibrate their decisions and recommendations and make sure they're consistent in that. And that takes some of the subjectivity out of the process. But as I say, one of the key things is really communication of the decision and making sure that that's done really, really clearly. So in many cases, if the author looked at the referee's reports and recommendations, it's really clear what the decision should be. But sometimes it's not necessarily clear. So, for example, sometimes a referee may recommend one thing, but actually from their report, it makes it clear that the decision should be something else. So they may recommend acceptance, but actually it's clear from their report that the article doesn't meet some specific criteria of the journal. And if the editor just sends a decision with one line saying it's not suitable, and the referee reports, the author will understandably be upset and maybe think that the wrong decision has been made. So the editor really needs to explain clearly why the decision has been made, what aspects of the report told them that that was the correct decision. And that's important with articles that have been sent for peer review, but also some articles we reject before peer review, and it's particularly important at that stage to be really clear in the communication. We know that authors really don't like their article being rejected before peer review with just one line saying that the article is not significant enough, or it doesn't meet this or that criteria. We really need to explain why it doesn't meet, what aspects of the manuscript have given us that impression, both so that the author understands why the decision's been made, also so the author knows that we have gone in depth to review the manuscript. So every time a decision like that is made at the RSC, an editor will have looked at the article in depth and discussed the article with the editors before making that decision. But if you get a short email, it can give you the impression that it's not had that scrutiny. So communication is really, really important. A couple of other things that we've introduced at the RSC relatively recently to try and help with transparency. One is the sharing of referee reports after the decision has been made with the other referees. So when a decision is made, all of the referees for the manuscript will see all the reports. So that helps them understand why decisions have been made, particularly if it's a different decision to what they recommended. And it can also help educate new reviewers as to the sort of reports that are useful. And we've also, on 2 of our journals, introduced transparent peer review. So this is where the referee reports, editors' letters and authors' responses for manuscripts are published alongside the final paper for everyone to see what's happened in the process. Depending on the publisher, it may be optional or compulsory, and for some journals, the referees' names are also included in the reports. At the RSC, we have this on 2 journals, so RSC Chemical Biology and our new Environmental Science Atmospheres journal as well. It's optional for authors, and about 50% of authors select RSC Chemical Biology. The referees can't opt out if the authors opt in. The referee names don't appear in those reports unless the referee puts them in themselves. Other publishers handle this a little bit differently. So, for example, Institute of Physics requires opt-in from both authors and reviewers for it to go ahead.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Rich. And I noticed then when our editors were speaking, when Natalie and Sandeep were speaking, they both mentioned diversity in terms of choosing diverse reviewers and so on. Would you be able to say a couple of words about some of the activities that the Royal Society of Chemistry does around inclusion and diversity on our journals?
Certainly. So I think many of you viewing will know that the RSC released a report around this time last year looking at bias in publishing, specifically looking at gender, but we know that there are other biases as well. And we found that at all stages of the process, there are small biases that actually add up to quite a large overall bias. And we've been working ever since to try and address this and make sure that we can make our publishing process as inclusive and diverse as possible. And so there are some very clear actions we've gone ahead with. So, for example, making sure that our editorial boards and our reviewer pool reflects the gender diversity of chemistry. So those are very clear targets for us, but also on all of our journals and policies across publishing, we're examining every single process that we have to make sure that there's no conscious or unconscious bias, or that there's unintentional biases introduced, or that we reinforce any external biases, try and make sure that everything we do tries to eliminate any sort of bias whatsoever. And it's something that where you really need to go in depth. It's not having the intention to try and make sure your publishing process is not biased is really important, but it's just the start. You have to go through everything in detail to look for those unintended, unintentional things, to remove any conscious bias as well. So that's a process that we're going through at the moment, and we'll introduce things as we have actions to do there. That's
great. Thank you so much for that, Rich. And perhaps linked to those issues around unconscious bias or diversity, typically journals in our field in the chemical sciences operate what's known as the single blind peer review model. So that's where the reviewers are anonymous. What are some of the panelists' views? I'd love to hear from all of you on your views on different peer review models, for example, double blind peer review or transparent, which Rich has already mentioned, or open peer review. Does any panelists want to volunteer to go first on that one, or shall I call on someone? Oh, Natalie, great, thank you. Your connection's perhaps a little bit, there we go, that's better.
Okay, let's see. Let's hope the connection stands.
Yeah.
Yes. I have to say, yeah, I think actually there's benefit for both the single blind review as well as the double blind review. Yep. Let's say as editor, the single blind can be helpful because you can go and check, knowing who the author is, what the authors have done before. So it is a very simple help to check, is the paper only incremental to previous work, or really a step change? So that goes into what Rich talked about. Is it suitable for the journal? Is it really like of interest for our audience to actually publish this work?
We've lost you, Natalie. I'm going to try and...
Yeah, I think I was playing with the muting. I realized when I press a button, it mutes me. The single blind helps with checking for plagiarism, which is an unfortunate self-plagiarism, actually, unfortunate fact that sometimes happens. So it's not only to check for the step change and really like avoiding publishing incremental changes, but then really also to double check if there's self-plagiarism. So that's the advantage of the single blind one. Being an author myself as too, and not only an editor, I do understand the double blind review process, because of course that will help with maybe avoiding unconscious bias, let's say based on country, gender, whatever. On the other hand, usually you can make a pretty good guess, I have to say, as an editor, who potentially the author is. So I'm not really sure how much it helps. Admittedly, it's usually a guess, so you're never sure. So it could help avoiding unconscious bias. So I see really benefits in both, and I'm not sure if the experience of ChemCom shows, because I see ChemCom offers the double-blinded version, how many authors pick that, and if there's actually a difference in the results. So here, eventually would be nice to get the statistics, because I think it also would help us as associate editors or editor-in-chief.
Yeah, absolutely. Rich, do you want to come in there? You obviously are executive editor on ChemCom, so perhaps you can tell us a bit about the double blind on ChemCom.
Yeah, definitely. So this is something that we introduced on ChemCom in mid-2017. It's optional. So to give a little bit of background, double blind peer review is where the identities of the authors and reviewers are concealed from each other. The reviewers don't know who the authors are. And it's something that we had a lot of feedback from, particularly from researchers who were concerned that there might be bias against them in the single blind process. They felt that double blind would be fairer because referees would not know who they are. So the uptake so far on ChemCom this year, it's been 7% of manuscripts the authors have chosen to make it double blind. So it's a relatively small percentage of all of our submissions. And the main countries, authors from countries that have had the largest uptake have been India, Iran, and Brazil so far. One of the key challenges that Natalie mentioned is that authors not anonymizing their manuscripts properly is a big challenge. More than half of double blind submissions to ChemCom are not properly anonymized. This is usually because there's information in the main text that gives information about who the authors are. That's not necessarily the authors naming themselves, but often the style that an author writes a manuscript in, saying that their lab previously did this or that. It gives away who they are. But even if a large proportion of, a high proportion of references are from one particular author, that can indicate who that author is. We've recently extended an optional double blind to our environmental, some of our environmental science journals, and the uptake there is higher. It's between 14 and 27%. And we do know that the interest in the community varies by different topic areas on this. One of the drawbacks of the ChemCom system is that because it's optional, some authors can perceive that the referees will know that the double-blinded manuscripts are people who are perhaps lesser known, or people who are concerned that if it's known who they are, there may be bias against them. So it takes away some of the benefits in those authors' eyes sometimes. But there are challenges in making it compulsory. One, as I mentioned, is anonymizing manuscripts. In most cases, is information that gives away who the authors are. And if we made it compulsory for all authors to completely anonymize their manuscripts, it would involve us going back to them several times in many cases, and that could be a barrier to submission for many authors who aren't interested in double-blind. And also another thing is a more recent phenomenon is preprint servers. So any manuscript that's on a preprint server, you could realistically find out who wrote that manuscript by finding on a preprint server. So yeah, there are drawbacks to double blind, but in general, it is something that some authors can perceive to make the process more fair, remove any bias in the process. So it is something we continue to offer as a choice on ChemCom. In terms of what we do in the future, it's something that our journals will consider if researchers within that field express an interest for having double-blind peer review. And that's something, that's the reason why we launched this on our environmental science journals.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Rich. So we obviously want to listen to the community and what the journal community want from us in terms of peer review options. And you covered really nicely there the balance between being able to offer double-blind peer review as an option, but also some of the limitations and potential drawbacks of that. So thank you so much for that, Rich. Anyone else? So Sandeep or Beatrice, did you have any comments you wanted to add there on different peer review models?
Yes, my experience peer review is always normal peer review. As Natalie said, double-blind peer review is good, but the reviewer doesn't have information to check the novelty of the paper, because maybe it's coming from a lab that they do something similar, so it's not novel anymore. So we cannot evaluate that. In my opinion, I think the single blind peer review system is very good because the editor send the article to more than 2 reviewers. 2 is normally 3 or maybe 4. And I'm surprised because in RSC, in some journal, they send you the report of all the reviewers, and you can send your report and the one from other reviewers, and they are the same. In some questions, you are asking the same, even like other 2 reviewers. So you feel that this process is fair, is good, and it works because 2 people or 1 people or from different research group, different countries recommend the same as you.
Yes, so that's great. Thank you for that, Natalie.
We've heard a lot of
we've heard a lot of feedback from reviewers who are really positive about that initiative where we share reviewer reports after the decision, and they find it extremely useful and a good recognition for the work that they do as well. Thank you. Sandeep, did you have anything you want to add around different peer review models?
I would briefly add that, I am all for choices that one can make. As an author, if I have a choice to go for a single blind or a double blind, it's always welcome. It's a very forward-looking move in terms of having. So if there are authors who consider a perceptible disadvantageous position in terms of submitting an article to a particular journal, they can possibly choose between the 2, because having known the fact that, if you look at single blind review system, it is known and it is part of so many, discussions that there is a skew in the favor of better performing laboratories, more known authors, top institutions, that aside. But when you look at double blind system, as many of us have pointed out, that the question of total anonymity is certainly very, very difficult to achieve. But what I also want to sort of throw out in the open for our attendees is that, if I'm an author, I would like to stand by my science, in the sense that, I would like my identity to be out there. I would like it to be judged on the basis of who I am where am I from, and what kind of science I have done, achieved. See, because research is definitely a longer process. You have to, on your own merit, you first seek the funding from funding agencies within your country, right? There is a competition there. So you cannot anonymize everything. So once you have sought a public money, if you have sought taxpayers' money for your research, then at times, as an author, I'm not talking about as an author, it's very difficult to sort of anonymize my name and have the science go out in the open as a double-blind system. But having said this, briefly, I would like to just state that, if there is a section of authors who feel that having double-blind anonymity adds virtue, if there are younger investigators who are submitting their first, say, they are in their first 10 papers, they do not have enough confidence to go out in the open. If they feel that they come from a disadvantaged geography, that they would like to hide their identity, that all is well. But I would still like to see a single blind system where I can go back and look at what these authors have contributed in last 10 years, how they have developed a story, how they have come up with a research problem, matured it in a way which is logical, and leaving their own stamp in the field of their interest. So I think it's an interesting concept, but the choices have to be there so that authors can exercise. Back to you, Nicola.
Great, thank you so much for that perspective, Sandeep. One thing that Richard mentioned when he was talking earlier was that some of our journals also have started to offer what's known as transparent peer review. This is where we publish the reviewers' comments and the author's, the editor's decision letter and author's response alongside the manuscript. That's quite a new concept for us in chemistry. I don't think there are many journals doing that. Did any of the panelists? Is that something any of you have experienced or have opinions on before we move on to the next question? Natalie?
Yeah, I have to say I haven't experienced it, and I didn't know that the Royal Society does that. So I was very happy to hear that from Rich, because for the question about how could we change the current review ecosystem, I really like that idea. For a while, people also ask for the referee's name. I think that could be problematic, especially like what Sandeep said, for younger investigators. You depend on referees also for grant proposals, etc. But just publishing the review, and I'm really curious how the experience is that Rich has, just publishing the referee report with the SI, I mean, nowadays everything is online anyway, I think would help, because I think it may forces the referees to be sometimes less biased or actually provide good quality reports because they know it's there. Even if the name is not there, I think it would be super helpful. And I'm not sure if ChemCom also then publishes the response, because I know in the 60s, an electron microscopy journal had the referee reports as well as then the response for the referees. And I think, A, it's helpful to get good quality referee reports. B, I think as an educational tool for students or younger investigators, simply to see how do people answer to referee reports, how do they deal with criticism, because many cases, like Beatrice says, we want to have constructive criticism, and just to learn to accept it and how to respond and therefore actually use the criticism to improve the paper, I think would be super helpful. So I'm really curious what Rich says about his experience with this system. And me personally, rather than the double-blind review, I think publishing the referee reports anonymous with the response of the authors, I think would be super good and really educational for everybody.
Thank you, Natalie. That's great. So just to clarify, that's currently available on one of our journals, RSC Chemical Biology, and our newest journal, which has just recently launched, Environmental Science Atmospheres. So we have, as Rich mentioned, on that journal, RSC Chemical Biology, about half of authors opt in to publish their peer review, which we think is fantastic and shows that there's the demand for this. And we're really pleased to be able to showcase the sort of quality of our peer review in this way, and for all of those benefits, Natalie, that you outlined. So I'd really encourage anyone to have a look at that journal, RSC Chemical Biology, and take a look at some articles with published peer review and see what you think. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Rich?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry,
can I
Natalie.
ask, do you only publish the review or also the response?
Sorry, yes. So we publish the reviewer's comments and the editor's decision letter and the author's response. So yes, for those reasons that you said, it helps the reader understand, the whole process that the paper went through prior to publication, and is really potentially, of great educational value for those newer to the publication process. They can see the types of things that reviewers say and how authors respond, and how editors, the types of decision letters that editors send. So yeah, we hope it's a really positive step forward, and certainly something that we're considering, how we can expand to further journals, but it's still relatively new for us as well.
Yeah, I mean, Natalie makes a number of really good points there about transparent peer review, and I think particularly one of them is the educational aspect that Natalie mentions. I think a lot of first-time authors, they may get the decision on their manuscript, and even if they need to make revisions, they might be quite despondent about the number of changes that they need to make. But I think by seeing the reports for other manuscripts and understanding that actually almost every manuscript that is published will have had some revisions made to it, and so seeing that and seeing how authors respond to these, I think will really help those early career authors understand that this is part of the process, and it's not something they should get despondent about, and actually it is constructive. It's meant to help authors improve their manuscript. Everyone does it, and it's just part of the process, and we do have to make sure that those reports and comments are constructive. But yeah, if you're going into it being concerned that you're being asked to make changes and you're worried that everything else just gets accepted as it is, that's not the case, and this will certainly help people understand that.
That's great. Thank you, Rich. And so my last sort of formal question for the panel was around changes you would make to the sort of peer review system or ecosystem, if you like, to improve trust. And it sounds like, Natalie, for you, maybe a move to towards more of this transparent peer review would be a step in the right direction. Could I just ask whether Sandeep or Beatrice have anything they would like to add around improvements you would make?
Sorry,
go ahead, Sandeep.
Oh, okay. So just one line about this transparent system. I think it also will bring in what I would think of it as experiential learning, because when you are reading these comments, you are not only looking at how to respond to the comments, but you're also looking at a dialogue between established experts in the area, and what kind of thought processes go in when they ask questions, what are the outstanding issues which they hint at, and that is already like a sort of a mini chapter or a mini lesson basically on, say, a given area where you may be interested, or maybe 100 other people who would read that paper would be interested in the area, and they could see that how experts communicate with each other, trying to sort of address of a problem in a niche area, very focused problem in a niche area. So that kind of experiential learning from transparent review should not be sort of overlooked. I think this is going to be a game changer if I were to add at this point of time. That's a very, very remarkable effort. I think I should kudos to chemical biology, RSC Chemical Biology, for coming up with this process, which is going to be really helpful. But if I were to just add a couple of lines before I give it back to you, that I would like to sort of see in future how the editorial management software becomes more responsive to the growing needs of not only authors, but also growing needs of editors, because we are thrown into, this battleground, so to say, where you have to sort of look at, comments, and you are trying to make a sort of adjustment between what you have seen as a review and how to communicate and how to select. So this entire gamut of editorial activity that has to happen at the associate editor end would tremendously be helpful if we have statistical data on a reviewer. I mean, what kind of bias that particular reviewer has had. I mean, have they been declining invitation because they have authors from a particular geographical location, or if they have been declining invitation, if they have a particular gender. So that kind of statistical data, if it is just available to the associate editors or editorial sort of this ecosystem, that would be really helpful. So make the management software a bit more intelligent. So I don't want to use the often used term of artificial intelligence, but just make it a bit more intelligent so that it can perceive quite a number of inputs. They could be good inputs. They could be sort of inputs that are going to put the red flags. And also, I would request, again, suggest rather to Rich and you and RSC that can we think of a 5-minute condensed videos or kind of guidelines for new reviewers? Because you see, as we move along, every year we add a lot of new faculties, we add a lot of new reviewers, and they do not have experience. They may have experience of answering the questions that reviewers have asked while they are writing papers, but they sometimes do not know how to look at a paper holistically and come up with their suggestions. So just condensed videos which are available on our website, RSC website, which people can click, new reviewers can click, and just learn about the process. So those are my two suggestions. Back to you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sandeep. So I think, yeah, more artificial intelligence would definitely help make our lives easier as long as it worked well. And certainly a suggestion for sort of reviewer education is one I really like. Natalie, did you want to come in?
Just a good, I very much like what you said, Sandeep. And I think also here, publishing the reviews actually will help, because like you said, they can watch a video, but also for the new reviewers to read how other reviewers did the job, I think will help. I fully agree, because we never educate our students or postdocs and then future academics how to review a paper. And I think there's sometimes also regional differences, and that really would be very helpful. I absolutely agree.
Great, thank you so much. And Beatrice, did you want to come in on your views on sort of future improvements?
Yes, for improvement, I agree with them. Instead of maybe double per review, try to increase the number of journals in which you put the report, because in some journal you can see original version from the author. Just to publish the review reports and the question from the authors, because that really help new reviewers and also can help new authors to improve the article. So I think it's very good. Also, when I review a paper, I think very, very helpful that after an IRC journal, most of them do it. After the first page with the number of the author and the abstract, they give you another page with very quick white lines about how you need to do the review for that specific journal. So that really helps a lot. And maybe there you can include a link to the tutorial of the video that Sandy said.
Yep.
Mostly I agree with them with the maybe publishing the reports and everything without the name of the reviewers, but that will really help a lot.
That's great. Thank you so much. So it sounds like there's a lot of support there for more transparent peer review, as well as better reviewer education to help improve things for the future. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to, in the last sort of 5 minutes or so, just check with my colleague Emma, who I think was having difficulties, but I think is back, whether there are some questions that remain unanswered from our audience who've put their questions in the chat.
Yes, I'm back. Thank you, Nicola. Yeah, there was a few questions in the chat. One question for Natalie. You'd mentioned that you used referees known to you personally. Do you think that this might introduce bias to the system? Would you potentially weigh the opinions of those people higher than those of other referees?
I would actually not weigh them higher, but like Beatrice says, it's very often the case that we get referee reports with the same opinion, but it really helps gauging the breadth of the answers. So it's not that I would value them more or less, but it gives me sort of a benchmark, what I would expect, not from the input and the criticism or actually the praise for the paper, but really like a balance where I also expect the other referee reports to be. So usually there are referees that often referee. So it's sort of really like knowing the quality of the, I know these referees know how to write referee reports, let's put it like that. So it goes a bit into the discussion we just had. Sometimes you choose referees based on their previous work and their expertise that you find either via Scholar One or let's say Web of Science. But it's more difficult than to judge how experienced they are in writing referee reports. So it's really this balance that I try to achieve. So
yeah, and
that's how
it
I
sounds
use them.
like Natalie, rather than maybe knowing them personally, it's more knowing them as reviewers, so knowing they've reviewed before and trying to balance that with people you don't know so well, and
Exactly.
getting a good balance.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I call
that's
them my
great.
pet referees, so it gives me a standard what I would expect.
Great, thank you so much. Any other questions, Emma, in the last few minutes?
Yes, so there was a comment relating to peer review rigour, and the delegate wonders, should errors in published papers be assessed and tracked in order to measure peer review rigour, and what are the panel's thoughts about that?
So I guess they mean if a published paper ends up needing to be corrected or retracted, for example. So
That's right.
whether that would be a way to measure the rigor of peer review, I guess, is that the question?
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yes.
Don't know if anyone has any thoughts there.
Well, I may chip in here. Sometimes it's very difficult. I mean, sometimes it's obvious plagiarism that you can find. Let's say also self-plagiarism that goes again for the single blind review versus double blind. But sometimes it's very difficult. I mean, even referees, in case somebody, let's say, cherry-pick data or whatever, let's say SEM pictures on nanoparticles or whatever, how do you as editor or even as a referee, if you don't have the raw data, how can you figure this out, you know? So there are referees, and we have cases where it's very clear certain data were copied because two graphs are identical or things like that. These are obvious. They are often spotted, if not by the editor, by the referees, but they're really cases of scientific misconduct, which is really difficult. So I would not put that into the rigor of the peer review. I mean, it is here to check for that, but sometimes it's pretty impossible unless you have the raw data.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Any other comments on that one before we go?
I agree with Natalie. If you trust in the data you are looking at in the paper, is fair and is good. The only way you can detect plagiarism, but the only way you can detect that is to have the raw data. Some journals give the option now to give the raw data, and authors should consider if they want to give or not. But if you don't have it, there is no way to know if there is something bad or wrong at some point.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we could probably take just one more question, Emma, if there is one.
Yes. One delegate asks, how useful is it to provide suggested reviewers at submissions, and are such suggestions taken into consideration?
Thank you. So I guess one for Natalie or Sandeep, if, yep, Natalie.
Yeah, I think it's actually very useful. And I think people maybe sometimes underestimate. To me, as an editor, especially in case it's a paper in my field, immediately gives me some intuition if actually the authors know the field by the suggested referees they provide. Sometimes you see people suggesting referee and then you think, why did they suggest these people? So you start to worry a bit, I have to say. However, when I see these referees are good matches and actually would have been referees I would have picked, it gives me immediately a bit of a confidence, and then I definitely will use the referees. But it really depends also on my evaluation. So I look at the paper, check what my analysis of the paper gives on what referees to pick, and then I go back and see what they suggested.
Yeah.
And in case there's an overlap, definitely I will pick some of them.
Great, yeah. Anything to add there, Sandeep, around recommended reviewers?
Yeah, I think I agree with Natalie that when you look at the suggested reviewers, that already tells you if you're looking at, top leaders who can actually critically look at the paper and provide an appraisal which is in line with what you would like to have for your journal. I mean, I say your journal means, see, as an associate editor, you basically own the journal and the papers being published. So if you look at a very restrictive list, which is say restricted to a geographical location, or there are numerous other points. I mean, I don't wish to elaborate, but what I wish to tell this attendee or the person who has asked the question, that we do choose reviewers from their suggested review. At least one is chosen, as long as the list is commensurate with what is paper and where their expertise lies. So yeah, we would definitely go, we honor, and also I would just add that we also honor at time, I mean, 100% honor if you say that please do not send article to these reviewers. So when you say that the reviewers we should not be chosen, that is adhered to without a question. But when you talk about suggested reviewers, then we look at their own capabilities, their own research areas, and then we would definitely choose at least one of the reviewers, one of the 2 or 3 reviewers that who would assess the paper and give us the comments. Thank you. Back to you, Nicola.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I guess the clear message there from the editors is that recommended reviewers are helpful, provided that you're giving them a sensible list of experts from a sort of diverse range, and not necessarily sort of people from down the hall who are going to give you a favourable review. So we'll leave it there because we've run out of time. So I think we'll have to wrap that up for today. I hope everyone attending enjoyed the discussion and found it informative. I know I thoroughly enjoyed myself. Thank you again to our absolutely wonderful panelists today, and to you, the audience, for joining us today. Just to finish, we will send a feedback survey after the event, so please do complete that short survey to let us know what you think. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.